Welcome, everyone, to today's Praxis Table Talk. I'm Mayloria, the Media Administrator, and today we will be discussing masculinity and femininity. Joining us today, we have our founder, Vincent.
Hello.
A very important member of leadership, Cody.
Hello again.
Also with us again, Koji.
Hello.
How are you guys doing today?
I'm doing pretty good.
Pretty good.
I'm excited for this episode. This one's been kind of a long time coming, I think, because I've done a lot of research for this one, but it's not been very direct research, right? It's been the type of research that you get as background information when you're reading other things. But there's a lot to unpack here when it comes to the topics of masculinity and femininity, because they are so big and broad topics. So this conversation is probably going to range from a wide variety of things. We're going to go from, taking masculinity and femininity as symbols within society, within, I would guess, psychology and other things like that. And we're going to go into how these things are supposed to be defined and where these definitions are even supposed to come from. And then also we can get into typical behaviors and I guess you could say themes related to both masculinity and femininity. There's a lot to discuss here, and so I am pretty excited for this episode. So does anyone have any opening statements before we kind of jump in?
Yeah. I do have to say that I don't have any resources for this episode. I'm just making up as I go. That's a joke, though. There is the discussion of whether or not chivalry is dead and we killed it, as a Nietzschean might say. But I think we have a pretty hard case for chivalry and damehood and all this, if not still alive, then coming back in full swing. And that's a very prospective sign to the health of our healing society.
Oh, yeah. Chivalry was actually one of those characteristics I was talking about, the type of behavioral theme that one could see when looking at masculinity, and then obviously the inverse of that would be damehood for femininity. So I am excited actually to cover those two different areas of discussion with this topic. But I guess we could start off with there was an article I found that kind of talks about the differences and similarities between men and women. And the guy here, I guess I can link the article. It's I don't know what the website is called. I think it's called empathywayofunion.com. So that's kind of a mouthful. But the guy here, essentially, what he does is go into a couple of different thinkers and a couple of different symbols that you can use to kind of characterize masculinity and femininity. He brings up Carl Jung, speaking of archetypes, which...
Oh, Jung is...
Oh, okay.
That's Jung.
Okay, well, yeah, he brings up Carl Jung, speaking of archetypes, and how he basically... kind of like how I touched upon the last episode, how masculinity and femininity are essentially two sides of the same coin, or it was a kind of... a whole broken into a half that needs to be unified through love. So I do think that this episode is a good, I guess, continuation.
Segue?
Yeah, a good segue. Or the last episode was a good segue into this one, and this one's a good continuation of the last one, because these two kind of themes go hand in hand. You have love, and then you also have masculinity and femininity, and these things are kind of representative of things which are a lot more abstract than they seem, and there's a lot more depth to them than it seems also. But yeah, he does bring up Carl Jung, and he also brings up Rudolf Steiner, who is kind of along the more esoteric line of thought, which I kind of want to get into as we go. And then he brings up a lot of things I'm going to cover in this episode. I actually have a list of notes that I've kind of taken down from this article. And then also I have another resource here, which I will link also, which kind of discusses the same thing, but from a different perspective, a more modernistic perspective, but still, it's still a I would say it's a good introduction to the topic for people who want to kind of give this a little bit more research. But I guess I'm gonna start off by, I would say, defining what masculinity and femininity is, and I would say maybe outline the distinct purposes and functions of these two different forces. And you guys can feel free to interject here as well, because this kind of is a group effort. But one thing I think of,
We just
huh?
we don't want to interrupt your beautiful flow of dialogue sometimes.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, so we have essentially, I would say, the masculine archetype or stereotype, or I guess I call it the masculine function. I call these things, I guess, different functions in society. That's the best way to characterize these, right? The masculine function is kind of related to the force of not generation, but creation. It's the kind of directive force. It's the one which is kind of holistic in its own. It can kind of stand on its own and is very transmissive. It gives things, it provides things as the provisionary force. And then the feminine force is the kind of inverse of that. It's the grounded one. It's the more symbolically earthly one. It's the receptive one. So where the masculine force is transmissive, the feminine one is receptive. And so where the masculine force is kind of like I said, creative and not generative, creative and directive. The feminine one is generative and receptive. And that, I think, is kind of the overarching theme of the episode, is by analyzing what I mean by this kind of dichotomy, which is a very real dichotomy. And then we can take it from there. So I guess, how would each of you define masculinity and femininity to begin with?
Well, it like you said, it is a more esoteric concept than people might think of, where you even have concepts going as far back as the ancient Chinese with yin and yang, with yin being feminine and yang being masculine, and this interbalance at play with aspects of the other within the opposite, but the opposite still being the origin of that other piece, if that makes sense. You know how the yin and yang symbol is the black and the white fused together, but there's the dot on each side that's the balance within both. And you even see the legends around that in ancient myths, with the sun and the moon being masculine and feminine respectively, and how these symbols are very entrenched in how we perceive the world. So it's a projection of this sexual dichotomy within the human condition onto the world around us that then is reflected back into us as well. And so it's what you were saying is a very good technical way of divvying up the masculine and feminine, but on a spiritual note too, it's important that this distinction exists, because there's a deeper psychological element to these concepts, and we see how important they are with their erosion in modern society and the ways in which our civilizations kind of break down when these concepts are eroded in any way. Things like the I guess air quote sexual marketplace, although I don't want to refer to it as a marketplace, with things like the incels and stuff we brought up last episode, or the Coomers or the e-girls and so on and so forth. And it's these perversions or exploitations of the masculine and feminine that come around to it being the man acting like men, which we'll get into in a second, and women acting like women, which seems intuitive enough, but we've forgotten what that actually means. So this isn't much of a definition, because I want to talk about that a bit more.
Yeah. This episode is kind of really about defining, bringing those definitions out of whatever discussion it is that we have. So yeah, I can definitely understand that. How about you, Goji? How would you define both of those concepts?
So for me, masculine, feminine, masculine would be the protective and providing aspect, while the feminine aspect is more of a creating and a sustaining aspect. So the masculine aspect exists to defend the feminine aspect, which creates.
Okay, yeah, I can see that. Um, that's what I mean, right? By the feminine aspect being more of the generative and the more kind of receptive, and then the masculine being more directive and things like that. But yeah, so I think that one thing that kind of permeates this discussion is the type of behavioral characteristics that are associated with each of these, and I do mean I do mean gender roles, as much as that comes across as like a a dirty word in our society. It does have some legitimacy when you look into pretty much every function of life. It does have that type of it does have a function in both kind of spiritual discussions like we've been talking about here, and then also in like practical discussion. Because if you look at everything, it's kind of, if you look at reality, it's kind of a holistic sphere. And so that's what I think that we can kind of dive into with this episode, is discussing and kind of refining these definitions, and maybe hopefully coming to. Oh, go ahead.
I actually had a bit of a revelation on the practical in regarding gender roles and stuff, like as you were speaking.
Yeah, go ahead.
And it's not just with gender roles themselves, but with like how Ted Kaczynski spoke about surrogate activities in people needing to apply themselves in what he referred the power process. There's a similar form of that in the sexual dimorphism of the human condition as well, where the erosion of traditional and historic masculine and feminine roles in society, these gender roles, have been either taken out and shown the prairie and shot, like some mice of men stuff, or been forcibly swapped and forced on the wrong sex for the respective role. And then you see phenomenon coming out where it's people trying to act in their respective gender roles, but in a negative form, because they have no avenue to actually express those either evolutionarily psychological processes or any of those deeper desires that they have. And one thing like that would be Karens in a lot of sense, which might be a good jumping off point for the episode.
Yeah. So what do you mean by Karens? Like, you mean like the Karen meme, right? Like the...
Yeah, the Karen meme phenomenon, whatever, around, what was it, like 2019, 2020 is when it like peaked in popularity.
Yeah.
Same with like the OK Boomer stuff.
Yeah.
And that's a whole nother thing with like boomers and the elderly and wisdom and stuff like that we'll get to maybe in another episode entirely. But with the Karen aspect of things, it's what you guys were just talking about, with women being receptive and generating life and being more or less the networks within communities to make sure that a community is being unified and there aren't things wrong. They're the communicative sex. And it's a lot of times you have these Karens that might be middle-aged white women that live in the suburbs and they don't have any family. If they did, their children are off and have made their own life, and there's no community really they have around themselves. So then they try to assert that communication through like being moral busybodies, being sort of chieftains on the behavioral aspects of people in broader society. Whether or not they're prompted or right to do so, they still feel the need to do that, and it's empty within their lives as is. Whereas historically, you'd have the daughters, wives, mothers, grandmothers, great grandmothers, even having this gatekeeping aspect on different levels of their family, their community, their tribe, and especially when it comes from the matriarch, the grandmother, the eldest women in a family, they'd be very choosy on who was let in on their communities and the upholding of the moral standards, whereas the men are usually like out expanding things and building stuff and keeping their own facets of the moral order in place, but in a different function. And that's a lot like how the Karens are acting today, but in a negative outlet because they have no positive outlets to find a proper suitor for their granddaughter, or to pass down some wisdom and some aspect through the things they've learned over their long lives and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
And it seems like it's these women that are finding surrogate roles to live out their gender role subconsciously, and it ends up annoying people because people are so antisocially adapted in modern society.
I think that kind of is a good representation of, because how last episode we talked about how love was kind of this holistic thing that was supposed to generate from within. It was supposed to be like a love for all things that is kind of reflected in the various things that you show love for. I feel like that is kind of showing how certain elements of masculinity and especially femininity with the Karen meme is kind of perversed in this society as well. It went through a sort of perversion as well because I feel like that Karen, that moral warrior, right? The necessity to kind of use how would you say, like moral policing, I guess you could say, as kind of like a surrogate activity is kind of, it seems to me like that's a negative outlet for the element of motherhood, right? You have the woman has the instinct and the function of the mother, and so when that's kind of taken away, and when you have kids move away and they're gone when they move away today. It's not like how it was before where they're right down the block, or they might even still be in the same house. But generally speaking,
multi-generational homes.
Yeah. Generally speaking, today they're entirely gone. They're off to college in another state, or they've joined the military, or they've moved. So there's a lot less of a family bond there now. It's more so everyone on their own. And so when the mother loses that child due to whatever it is, moving away or something like that, you have that instinct and that function that is no longer being fulfilled properly. And now the only thing left to do is fulfill it improperly, or else, that's essentially what there is left for the mother to do. So I think that's a good, interesting thing that you bring up. So the article here.
You even look at.
Oh, go ahead.
Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead. I was going to change.
You even look at you even look at more traditionally oriented societies as much as they still exist today, like the Eastern Bloc countries and more Asiatic countries, and you do still have those matriarchs, those closer family bonds that when the men aren't in the house making the big decisions, there's the mother or grandmother, or above even that, kind of guiding the family in day-to-day things, like the babushka and whatnot. And I even see that in my interactions with families from like Poland or Russia or China or Japan, and it's almost jarring to see from Western perspective, but that's a faculty of families that exist all around the world, and that's something that we've forgotten, mostly post-industrial.
You're familiar with the archetypes of both the civilization of the father and the civilization of the mother, right?
It sounds familiar.
It's essentially like you know how you mentioned earlier with the solar and lunar kind of symbols representing masculine and feminine symbols.
Yeah.
So essentially, actually, kind of a brief tangent from that. Tolkien in his universe actually flipped it. So I believe the moon was meant to represent the masculine symbol, and the sun was the feminine. But in Tolkien's universe, which I thought was interesting how he made that change to his mythopia, as it were. But yeah, so along with the more solar spirituality that you get from civilizations like or from mythologies like the Olympians, or like the Nords are a good one to reference with the Vikings, and like the Allfather, the Odin, and all of that, or places which reference their homeland as the fatherland. Those would be civilizations of the father, or civilizations of the patriarch, and essentially, the lineage is derived from the man, and the woman marries into the family, and the symbol there is masculine, and that means it is more holistic and divine in that sense of what we would call, quote unquote, upwards orientation. It's that, because I mentioned before, man is the more creative force, whereas woman is the more generating force. So when you get into things like Olympian civilization and things like that, you get this more hierarchical, and I would say, I don't know how to put this, but it's a more I don't want to say organized society, but it's differentiated distinctly from the civilization of the mother, which would be the inverse of that. So there's a focus on, I guess, in the civilization of the father, you would say there's a focus on solar functionality and spiritualism and religiosity and stuff. It's less devotional, it's more action based, and so with that type of civilization, you would see the Brahmins, or I could not pronounce the warrior caste. Basically, I couldn't pronounce it in the Indian. But yeah, those would be typical organizational structures of the civilization of the father, and then obviously you would have the patriarch. You would have the generating, or sorry, not the.
Oh no, the patriarchy. Oh no.
You would have the creative element be represented in the man, in the like in God or something like that. And then for the civilization of the mother, it's essentially the opposite, like I said. So wherever there would be a creative force, it's replaced with a generative force. So like the Egyptians is a good one to kind of look at this conflict in, because as the Egyptian mythology went on, it went from having a more solar tradition to having a more lunar or feminine tradition. So like in the newer versions of Egyptian mythology, you would see like the world is thought to have been created out of water, a generative force instead of a creative and directive force, which you would see in Ra. And so that's essentially one example. But yeah, there's a matriarchal foundation there. It's wherever.
Crazy to think.
Oh, go ahead.
Sorry. Crazy to think too that the last recognized pharaoh of the Egyptian Empire proper was Cleopatra, and her reign as a pharaoh, being female too, then saw the fall of Egypt as we know it as its ancient society to Rome. Very, very strange in that when you bring that explanation into how it transitioned to a more solar to lunar based
these
society.
things do kind of line up, you know what I mean? But yeah, so let's see, for example, the Egyptian
I wanted to add too.
Oh, go ahead.
That Judaic societies are very representative of the civilization of the mother, or the matriarch, and that's a very interesting thing to look at too.
I think they have both elements actually, because I guess if you say like early,
the Jew of the Bible, yes, the descendants of Israel and the
like Abraham
foundation of
things
Israel's
like that.
kingdom. Well, yeah, the Abrahamic religions, but Israel's the first king of the Israelites, the one who founded the nation under his name, which means to wrestle with God. Because
That was Jacob, right?
yeah, previously it was Jacob, and then
Yeah.
God renamed him to Israel.
I always found that story pretty interesting.
Yeah, and that's that sort of foundation in the sun and in the creative force, and the split from the Judaic peoples that we know of today versus the foundation of Christianity is what is the difference in that tradition going forward. Whereas Christianity historically had been that continuation of the Son, the society of the Father and whatnot, and what we know now as modern Jews are more matriarchal, and their women are much more assertive, and the men are much more passive, and so on and so forth. When you get down to how they operate within their own communities and societies, very interesting. Once you get to the meat and bones of it.
Yeah, it really there is a lot of continuity there. Stuff that you can see is changing, and the civilization of the mother always represented some kind of either inverse or traditionally speaking, it kind of like an inferior type of civilization to the civilization of the father. And so wherever there existed a civilization of the mother on its own, it was usually conquered or usurped or something like that by the civilization of the father. When you look at it historically, if there was ever a conquest, it was usually done by the one of the father, and then the one that was subordinated was the one of the mother. And if that was not the case, then you usually saw the solar principle get kind of subdued, and kind of they would try to incorporate it into lunar or feminine symbolism as well. So like I was saying earlier, the Egyptian Minoan representation, this is Evola speaking, by the way, the Egyptian Minoan representations of queens or divine women holding the lotus key, or holding the lotus and the key to life. That's one of the examples that I spoke of with the Egyptian tradition being more feminine in nature as time went on. But so essentially, I guess I would say this article that I have here says it best. The woman reflects the creative force of man, but he is the one who initiates it. And that's what you would kind of see with civilizations like Hindu, like Greece, and even early Christians, and even I guess I would say up until the High Middle Ages, up until Christianity lost that type of official initiatic element with the fall of the Templars and the initiatic orders that kind of came around with the Crusades and stuff like that. Christianity did hold a very masculine element itself, and it's kind of funny to look at how that has been subdued over time, and how you see the more feminine elements within the church. You know how you were talking before of how the church is, a lot of pagans criticize the church today for being too passive, too feminine, too lunar in their eyes. And
yes,
I think that you can see that kind of deteriorate, or that inverse kind of arrive sometime around the Crusades. After the Crusades, with the Reformation and all of that, so on and so forth. But yeah, so like I said, the woman reflects the creative force of the man, but he is the one who initiates it. So this article actually does explain it in kind of better terms than I would. So I'm going to read a section from the article.
I was going to expand on that last point you had just real quick.
Oh yeah, go ahead.
Post-Crusades as well is the European nations more or less stabilized. There was some fighting amongst themselves, but there was no real external threats, and most of the continent has pretty much adopted Christianity, I think, explicitly. So it was a lot of empire building by that time, and then moving on into the Renaissance, you have expeditions into the New World, which then had this transition around that same time too, from the warrior class that was the Crusades, and ruling over society, even with popes. I forget his name. He's like Pope something the seventh, was referred to as like the warrior pope, and he actually stacked bodies under himself, with him being the head of the church at this time, being this masculine figure, this patriarch of all of Christendom. And then it transitions to more mercantile peoples, like the Medicis, or like those Judaic peoples I mentioned, coming in and ruling through finance. With, I think there was even one Medici that did become a pope, if not a very high-ranking bishop. I gotta check my history on that, but I know there was a Medici that got in a very high position in the church, and they were the banking family that ruled Florence and at one point most of Italy. So you can see the transition on a whole from this warrior class that brought Europe probably to its heights of civilization, into this mercantile class, which we're in now and kind of devolving out of. And it is that lunar spell that's been brought over and even imported through more subversive means by external tribes.
If you know, it kind of what you were saying. Oh, damn, I dropped my damn phone. All right. What you were saying there, yeah, it kind of does symbolize, because you know you have the feminine element representative of more materially conditioned activities, or just the more materially conditioned principles in general is represented by femininity, and more spiritual, more metaphysical principles are represented by the masculine principle. And so, you know, with the shift that comes, you know, through the devolving of spiritual authority, and you get more temporal authority within, like, you know, how the church kind of lost its power, and it kind of lost its, and you know, the European kingdoms kind of lost their first priestly and then second warrior element to them. And this is not just Europeans that underwent this change, but you know, many civilizations, but those are just the ones that, you know, I'm most familiar with. It is a change from that more solar, that more masculine, that more divine element, to that more materially conditioned element with the rise of the merchant class. So like how you were talking about with the Medicis and all of that. Yeah, it is part of that transition between masculine and feminine. It's represented by that. And so when we speak in symbols, you know, it's actually very easy to spot. Once you know what the symbols are, it's very easy to spot them in society as a whole. It's very easy to spot them, and that's one of the things with symbolism too. This is kind of another tangent, but it's not just you know, academia, right? It's not just like within literature there are certain literary elements that can be seen as symbols. It's not just that, right? It goes beyond that. When you look at femininity, you can kind of align it with specific elements within society, and same thing with masculinity, and then those things become symbols within themselves. But then also you can see that as things change, as things kind of go on, you see feminine principles, or things that were symbolically associated with femininity, also become kind of raised up or promoted along with actual femininity, or I guess you would say feminism, right? And so as you know, as society goes on, you know, you mentioned kind of like the involution of the Judaic people, with the kind of going from the masculine to the more feminine oriented things. Same thing in Europe. You have masculine kind of like regal kingships kind of be subdued as time goes on by the more feminine or material merchant class. And the same thing with America, where you had even in its beginnings, you had a more warrior, a more religious society, now kind of being subdued by a more merchant class, or a more even a more feminine society, actually, right? You have the feminine principle being kind of valued a little bit more than the masculine principle. So we are watching these civilizations of the father, or I guess things that started as civilizations of the father, kind of really be flipped on their head and turn into civilizations of the mother. And that's kind of the symbolic element of what I was bringing up before with those two different types of civilizations. And I do think that it's cool that you can kind of characterize certain elements by referring to them as that, and then see that continuity change, because it really is kind of demonstrative of the whole aspect of what we're talking about here with these two, and then also with the whole social changes that you see, as time goes on. But
you were gonna change the subject?
Yeah, I was kind of reading this article here. So one of the things that this article kind of emphasizes that I brought up in the beginning of the episode, it's a little bit farther in, but it says, let me see where I can find it. Another thing, the energy always flows from the male to the female. The most important quality of the male body is that it is not receptive, it is always aggressive. The male can give, but he cannot take. No current flows from the female to the male. It is always from the male to the female. The female is receptive, she can take, but she cannot give. And when I first read that, it was interesting for me to hear, because that's generally not how you would traditionally characterize it. You know what I mean? But as I thought about it, it does kind of make sense if you contextualize it with what we're talking about here. And it says, let's see, there are two results of this, and both are worth knowing about. The first result is that since the female is receptive, she can never become the giver. And this is a Hindu term, Shaktipat. I have no clue. I think it's Hindu. It says it cannot take place through her. I'm guessing it means transmission, right? Transmission cannot take place through her. This is the reason why there are so few female masters in the world, nor are there any female gurus of the stature of Buddha or anything like that. And as we examine these different things, that is kind of true. You know what I mean? So this is not wrong when you contextualize it. And it says the reason that no energy can be imparted to anyone through her. The reason is that no energy can be imparted to anyone through her. So that's kind of like wrapping up my earlier point, as in the female is kind of the receptive principle. It's the generative principle, but not the creative one. It's the accepting, but not the directive one, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that historically you do kind of see that, but more contemporarily you can understand this in conversations like Academic Agent and Philosophicat had when they were going over the writings of Evola, and how Philosophicat, her being female, in case no one is familiar with these YouTube commentators, she was very frustrated in finding a man that she can settle down with because of the education and enlightenment she's received from Evola and a lot of the other elite theorists, and her own spiritual journey, because so many men of today are diluted in that sense of direction, especially on a spiritual level, that she is trying to find someone who can direct her, and that she can be receptive of on a higher spiritual plane than herself, and that's something that she's cognitively craving, but can't find within modern society because it's so rare with how everything's been subverted or flipped on its head. But even more historically, you see that in the I don't know how a good way to put this, the subordination of the female to the masculine, in any sense of the community or the nation or whatnot else. And that's not saying that women have to be subservient or something, and you better stay in the kitchen if you know it's good for you, type of deal. It's a little more nuanced than that, as much as we might like that image in our head. Joke, by the way, joke. And it is more that, like I said, when the men aren't around making the big decisions, it's the women being the communicative ones and taking care of the day-to-day stuff.
Yeah.
But when it comes down to it, the men have to make the big decisions because when there's an invading army coming in to sack and pillage your town and your kingdom and your empire, the women, unless it's like a very exceptional force like Genghis Khan, where many of the women would rather throw themselves off the top of the Great Wall, and even kill themselves and their children too to prevent them from being captured and raped by the Huns. Those are much more exceptional circumstances, but in most circumstances, the women would kind of just protect their children and go along with the invading army if their men lost, because that's just better survival right there. It makes sense for a woman to do so because their main prerogative is protect their children and perpetuate the culture that they're in as much as they can. And that then comes in with, well, if there's some invading force, time to subordinate myself to these new, even more masculine invaders. Even if they don't necessarily want to, it's just easier that way for women to do, because it's not like most women can take up a sword and competently fight off an army of men. Again, very exceptional cases like Spartans might be a situation where that could happen, but again, they're exceptions.
Yeah.
The men in that circumstance, though, would be defend our country and community to the last man until we fend off the invaders or kill off all of them. And even in a losing battle, they'll have that last stand where it might seem hopeless, but they'll keep fighting to defend what is theirs and what they know as theirs, because it's either servitude and slavery or you're getting executed anyways. So it was far more honorable and productive in their eyes to risk getting killed in the heat of battle to protect themselves from this invading force than to just give up and give in to their demands, because it'll only get worse from there, as we see now with overreaching governments and the submissive peoples that we have in this more feminized society giving in to more and more demands, and then the consequences are becoming ever more evident.
You know, there's kind of a lot to unpack with what you just said. I kind of have a lot of things I wanted to point out. So, so the first one was the meme of the woman in the kitchen thing, and that's true. Is that I'll make this point first, because I think this one is actually a little bit more. This one kind of guides into that one, but so with the point you were bringing up about the one girl who doesn't want to, or the one girl who's having a kind of like a crisis on finding the right partner, right? That is a very difficult topic to go about in today's society. I guess that's a very difficult endeavor to kind of embark on in today's society, because not only is it very difficult to find a correctly oriented religious or spiritual guy in general, but it is also very difficult to weed out the ones who don't know what they're talking about from the ones who do. You know what I mean? It is very difficult to weed those out, because the inversion and the perversion goes on so far that you might have someone who kind of dictates all the correct talking points, or maybe has an image in their head of what they want, but the way they go about expressing it and the way they go about actually being a gentleman, so to speak, is not actually correct. You know, they might end at the woman in the kitchen meme. You know, they might not actually understand all the implications of both masculinity and femininity and what those actually properly mean. They might just take the surface level social structure for what it is. You know, and that's the case with a lot of people who consider themselves traditionalists. They would look at a specific point in a society that they want to kind of harken back to, without understanding the principles which make up that society, and also understanding that that point in time can never be returned to, because the various contexts and stuff like that are just like, even if you were to return to that, the way you grew up has dictated that you are not going to behave the same way in that situation. It's just that's just kind of how life is. But for example, the one of the things that Vola points out is that let's see. I'm gonna go down here. Okay. On the basis of the duality man-woman, which is the premise of the new types of civilization, it is possible to define the following types. And the first type of civilization is the Titanic one in a negative sense, and refers to the spirit of a materialistic and violent race that no longer recognize the authority of the spiritual principle corresponding to the priestly symbol or to the spiritually feminine brother. And he uses Cain and Abel as a kind of symbol here. And then he says, this race affirmed itself and attempted to take possession by surprise and through an inferior type of employment of a body of knowledge that granted control over certain invisible powers inherent to things and people. Therefore, this represented an upheaval and a counterfeit of what could have been the privilege of a previous glorious men, namely of the virile spiritually connected to the function of older and of domination from above. So essentially what he's saying here is that it's not enough to be aggressive as a man. What he's saying is that in the Titanic myth, right, the myth of the Titans, you see an aggression that is misguided. You see a masculinity that is substanceless. It's form without substance, and it's lost sight of what the function actually was of that form. So to be masculine meant to, it meant to pillage. It meant to take by force, and it meant to kind of impose yourself. But to what end? You know what I mean? It was very much a means to an end, but the end was forgotten, and the whole propriety of the subject was kind of lost. And so what he's saying is that this represented an upheaval and a counterfeit, so like a kind of perversion of what could have been the privilege of the previous glorious men. So people who actually do know masculinity. So going back to what I was talking about with that situation, even if you do find someone who maybe understands a little bit of masculinity, or maybe understands the gist of it, but doesn't understand the function, you're still screwed, right? It's still wrong. Just because some of the elements are there, maybe more of the elements than we see typically in our society today, maybe more may be present there. That doesn't mean that they're all present there, and that doesn't mean that it's actually perfect. You know what I mean? That doesn't mean that she found the right guy.
If it's all theory and no application, then the theory is worthless because it's not being actualized.
Right. And in the inverse of that also, if it's all application and no theory, then that's also wrong. And so...
yeah, that's where you get toxic masculinity, or how
exactly
feminists might say. And that's something I think we should get into just after this.
Yeah, I was going to make a couple more points, but yeah, that is... So that's kind of what I was saying, is that even if you do find someone who might be of the right disposition, they might not be of the right mindset. You know what I mean? And so that's another fault that she's going to have. So it is very difficult to find someone who actually knows what they're talking about and actually can apply this theory and this knowledge directly within their life and be that guiding force. But the second thing, actually, here, let me pick up my phone from the floor. It says, there was a post I found earlier, a long time ago actually, and it kind of characterized this exact thing, where the women in the kitchen meme has become so popularized among traditionalists that they think that that's actually the right kind of way to go about it. Like, that's the only substance there. You know what I mean? The right direction to...
Oh my goodness.
Huh?
Oh no, I'm just reacting to traditionalists and that this highly skewed mindset of
femininity and
masculine femininity.
Yeah. So it basically says, the woman in the kitchen is a funny meme, but they are worth more than a golem at your command to change nappies and whip up casserole. Throughout history, they've kept tradition alive when men died in battle, provided care to the sick, boosted morale in times of famine, and were among the most educated of the nobility since they had more time for academic study, whereas the rest of the leisure class were off delegating and training. A noble woman would be knowledgeable of art, literature, scripture in particular, music, both vocal and often instrumental, fashion, and of course they were by no means ignorant of foreign affairs. In the absence of bards, it was the women who crooned the stories and sang the songs of their people, who were told which were told for generations, all by heart. And so the next time some whore of Babylon proclaims to be queen or respectable independent woman, ask her not her opinion, but what she knows of her own folk. The arts and the arts and municipal happenings.
A little tongue-tied, but
Yeah.
yeah, no, that's
Sorry.
actually one of the
It
things.
took me a second to process that.
Sorry about that.
It's fine. But yeah, like examples of that of the women doing exactly that throughout society is what's so important about it, because men and women are needed in their roles to make a functioning society. And when things go awry, one way or the other, it's the duty of the other side of things to bring balance back into it. Otherwise, everything just devolves. And one of those grand examples is what's her name? Olga of Kiev. In the late 900s AD, her husband was the patriarch and beginning of one of the Tsar dynasties in Russia. And he was killed on an expedition. And so her response, since the next heir to the throne was her son, at the time only 3, was to hold on to power until her son could properly take the throne, and absolutely eviscerate the peoples that killed her husband, which is something that if it was any woman in any position of power could do, should do. And fellas, if you don't find a woman that would do that for you, if you died in some foreign affair and then have your lady then seek revenge on such a cataclysmic scale, she might not be the right one. So
There you
there
go.
you go.
Yeah.
But there's other examples of women acting in such a regard throughout history, and absolutely no one at the time of her taking control of the what do you call it? The kingdom had a problem with it. Like none of the priests or the nobility or anything, because she was a lady, and a lady in a regal position is the same as any knight, which is for the female counterpart damehood. And it kind of goes along the same concepts of chivalry. And chivalry is something I think we'll get into in a second, because it's the codified application of masculinity in European societies for the longest time.
Not just in
And
European
something
ones,
that's
but yeah.
Yeah, but chivalry specifically for is like the European knight concept. But
Yeah.
there's these applications all throughout history, like Bushido in Japan, or in what chivalry is based off of in the Middle East, and so on and so forth. But damehood is something that's so that was so ingrained in women in these societies back then, and something that should be stressed once more in us moving forward in society, not to try and recreate the past like we've said so many times, but to use our situation now and apply the same principles and just rock on forward.
Yeah.
Because you don't have these egregious exceptions of women trying to act like men, but women being women and then reacting accordingly when the man in their life is no longer there, or is in some sort of dire need of something. And then once a proper masculine figure, whether it be their son or their husband or whomever that can fill that role properly, and not just someone trying to be an opportunistic grifter, they concede that and subordinate themselves to that masculine presence once more. And that's just been the historical norm, because we keep reinforcing, when shit goes down, it's the men that have to bear the brunt of the cataclysms in society. And you can see that even today, like when natural disasters happen, the first responders and road workers and more industrial type men are men, overwhelmingly majority male, and they're the ones that are acting and reacting on the fly to changing circumstances to save people's lives and livelihoods, and that's the typical welfare of things as society moves.
Kind of what you're talking about brings up there are two myths. There's one of Orpheus, which is actually brought up here in this article I was reading. I was going to read a kind of excerpt from another article I had up. But yeah, one myth is Orpheus, and then another myth is of, oh man, what was his name? It's on the tip of my tongue. The myth of Sigurd. Do you know the myth of Sigurd?
I haven't heard of either of them, actually.
Oh, okay. Well, essentially, both of these are myths of the type that kind of characterize a masculinity that is. Well, okay. So the myth of Sigurd is essentially that he has to. Both of these are essentially the damsel in distress archetypes, right? You have.
Oh, okay.
That's kind of where both of these came from, and one is Greek and one is Norse, but. Yeah, so that's what they symbolize. If you, I would recommend actually going and reading the myth because it's kind of a lot. I don't want to kind of reiterate it all here, but essentially, yeah, it is the damsel in distress archetype of stories that you can see has been adapted many times throughout history. But this is kind of where it all started, and it is very representative of that masculine necessity to go and kill the big bad or do the thing to save the woman, kind of be that directive, aggressive, and transmissive force which the woman feels the result of. You know what I mean? And so yeah, what you were saying there with when a proper man comes along, it makes it easier for a woman to kind of accept him and be receptive of him because he actually does embody these characteristics. And so yeah, the thing I was going to read is it says, let's examine something from our daily man-woman relationships. Let's see. Some of the guys reading this material, which are interested in behavioral sciences, probably know that the gulls are driven back off men who are undecisive and lead decision-taking to someone else. I think that from an esoteric viewpoint, this is a manifestation of the principle in women's subconscious-driven behavior towards indecisive men. On a subconscious level, they expect to be, quote-unquote, penetrated by a man's determination. And it says women are more emotional than men. Let's see. This can leave us to the conclusion that men have a more developed. Let's see. It says fifth chakra, but I want to kind of like translate that from the more esoteric terms that they're using here. But essentially, men have a more developed drive to them, a more developed directive and. I guess directive force, you could say. And then it says, most probably this is the energetic reason for men being the more rational half of humanity. And then he goes down to say, I'm not trying to discriminate anybody. As I have said, both genders have different roles in life, and knowledge about this can help one to have a better understanding about his existence. Women tend to use the cortex part of their brain, which is responsible for creativity. The right brain hemisphere is responsible for emotions and creativity, which is what they use. It says the left half of the neocortex is responsible for logical thinking, which is what men use a little bit more. And so that's essentially kind of the more... he's kind of translating here. He's translating these different symbols that you can find with masculinity and femininity and talking about how they practically work. You know what I mean? It's not just symbols. It's that there actually are functional differences within the brains of man and woman that direct how each of these behave. And so each of these behaviors, I think this is a good time to take this down the chivalry and damehood way, because each of these behaviors have developed and have created expectations surrounding them, which kind of epitomize with the type of chivalry and damehood that we're talking about here in this episode. So, yeah, do you want to kind of get started on that, or do you have some closing thoughts on this topic?
The only thing I think I'd add is one of the myths that, or well, myths, but probably more close to history, since the Iliad turned out to be fairly true, is the Odyssey, that sort of encapsulates all this stuff fairly well from what we've said in the story of both Odysseus and his wife, where he's off on this voyage that's cursed by Poseidon, and getting back home, and him losing all his crew and coming up against all these various mythological creatures, just barely getting by. And his wife very patiently and devotedly waiting for him to return and fulfill his role as king of their kingdom. Meanwhile, she's getting suitors left and right, all coming for her to fill the role that Odysseus has left, and she's just not having it, and being that dame, and in being that baroness, as she would have been,
Right.
to hold down her kingdom and wait for her her husband to return and bring order back to their home.
Right. You know, I think that kind of characterizes a little bit of the next topic in general. Like, you know, I think that is a good segue. So
Yeah,
I guess
I could start off with the Ten Commandments of Chivalry I have in front of me.
you know what's funny is I have the same exact thing in front of me. Yeah.
Oh,
Go ahead. Go ahead.
All right. So, as it goes, it's Gaudier's Ten Commandments of Chivalry.
Yeah.
And it goes down: 1, thou shalt believe all that the church teaches, and thou shalt observe all its directions. 2, thou shalt defend the church. 3, thou shalt respect all weakness, and shalt constitute thyself the defender of them. 4, thou shalt love the country in which thou was born. 5, thou shalt not recoil before the enemy. 6, thou shalt make war against the infidel without hesitation and without mercy. 7, thou shalt perform scrupulously thy feudal duties, if they be not contrary to the laws of God. 8, thou shalt never lie, and shalt remain faithful to thy pledged word. 9, thou shalt be generous and give largeness to everyone. And 10, thou shalt be everywhere and always the champion of the right and good against injustice and evil.
I think that's, you know, I think that it's very interesting to look at, because what people think chivalry normally is versus what it is characterized by these 10 commandments here is that it is a very religious conception. And I think most people forget that.
Mm-hmm.
Most people think, you know, in modern times, chivalry is used kind of as a rhetorical device for something like an ethical man, right? Oh, he's a gentleman because he holds the door. He's a gentleman because he, you know, so on and so forth. And that's what I think is one of those things which is unfortunate, that we have lost the true definitions of something like chivalry, because it goes beyond that, right? It's all about devotion. And it's about devotion to good and devotion to God. And in this case, it's devotion to the church, which I actually think is, if you had if the church was in a properly organized and instituted position, I think that is definitely a warranted loyalty. And so yeah, it's interesting also that the first two it's thou shalt believe all the church teaches, thou shalt defend the church, and then even down here, you shall perform your feudal duties as long as they're not contrary to the laws of God. So, and in this last one here, it's, you know, the right and good against injustice and evil. So it does put God first, and then it puts good first, also right and good. And obviously these are defined. Oh, good.
God and good kind of have similar roots, so you can see the reasoning there why they're number one. They're one and the same.
Yeah.
In the mind of the chivalrous.
Yeah, and it really is. So I guess you could say good is defined by the church, because the church kind of interprets the word of God, and so all of these things are interconnected within that regard. But then also, you know, you have these little ones in here which are kind of forgotten about, also, which is thou shalt love the country in which you were born, and let's see, the recoil before the enemy is kind of mainstream, and so you know about that one. And okay, so here's an interesting one, right? Thou shalt make war against the infidel without cessation and without mercy. And so a lot of people, pagans especially, will characterize Christianity as very passive and very feminine and very pacifist. And what's funny is that the older codes and the older standards of chivalry that were upheld during the Middle Ages were one of make war against the infidel, right? Make war against sin and against evil.
Mm-hmm.
And the infidel would be one who is a sinner and who is an evil person. And so I do think that it's interesting. A lot of these are forgotten. I think the only ones that are kind of remembered within chivalry today are number 9, thou shalt be generous. Maybe let's see,
number
5.
3, was it the weak?
Oh yeah, thou shalt respect all weaknesses. Yep, and constitute thyself as the defender of them. Yep, and then also thou shalt not recoil before thine enemy. That's another one. I think those are the 3 that are most remembered today. Well, all the rest of these are forgotten, but these do constitute what chivalry is in a larger sense. But I think
this should be.
Oh, good.
Oh, sorry.
No.
Because I just wanted to give greater context to that, because a lot of, even the ones that are still remembered today, have been perverted or twisted for more modernistic means. And there was a post made by someone who we hope to have on the show soon enough, a man by the name of Vercingetorix95, his online moniker, made a post saying it was basically impossible for a healthy male to be weak in pre-industrial society. Everything required great strength and constant movement. That some knights were considered superhuman in modern parlance compared to men of the levy. One has to wonder how great the disparity would be when comparing a modern fighter to their medieval or ancient counterparts. Tech can impress any primitive, but would the physicality of our modern special forces be anything impressive to a knight, centurion, or hoplite? And that's a point he stresses very much in another post where people were attacking him on this, where he was saying that when you have society oriented around everyone being strong, and strong in the aspects divided on the sexual dimorphism of our species, men being strong in the will and in the body, and in women being strong in the home and in the spirit and creation. Those are the complementary forces that make a holistic, long-lasting society that does great things. And when most people were strong, that gives you room to help and preserve the weak because they had trouble doing it themselves, whether they were infirm or whether they had some fatal flaw in their character that through great effort could be overcome with the help of those who have already overcome it. And that's the point that we need to kind of reinforce today as well, because so many people are just fine with being weak, and especially having the excuse of some technology filling the gap there for them. And it's this sort of transhumanist mindset that is, even on more right-wing and traditionalist spheres, corrupting the ideas that we're trying to promote.
Yeah, even preserve.
And that's damaging. Yeah, or preserve, and that's damaging our goals in the long run.
Yeah, it really is something that is being kind of forgotten, especially on our side, as things become kind of modernized, and commodified, especially. Even these older ideas that hold resonance among a lot of people still become commodified in some way, where you'll have people who value them maybe for aesthetic or maybe for like a practical purpose or something, but they don't actually take them to heart. You know what I mean? It's very commodified, and they take it at surface level. And I doubt very many people have actually done the research and gone into depth that even that we have, and we're who are we, right? So the fact that this has to be an episode at all, you know what I mean, is kind of telling that a lot of these elements that are so obvious or so intrinsic to our behaviors and our values just as people have been inverted or lost or flipped on their head or something like that. But I had something here that kind of defined what makes a gentleman, and because gentlemanliness is something that's kind of associated with chivalry. I would say it's more so the modern, maybe not the modern, but the next stage of chivalry. It's the more I guess it's chivalry in peacetime is how I would define gentlemanliness. You know what I mean? And essentially it says, where was it? Oh man, I just had it up and now I lost it. Okay, well, essentially it was characterizing gentlemanliness, and here it is. It says, if a man wants to be a good man, a gentleman, he must commit good actions. He realizes his responsibility for his actions and his accountability for the results of his actions. Whatever you do or don't do affects you and everyone around you in one way or another. You're responsible for the effects of your actions have, and no amount of excuses and apologies can change that. As soon as you realize how your actions affect others, how you are accountable for the joys and pains you might inflict, the way you view how you act changes. And that's kind of the point I was making earlier, is that, as we kind of discuss and identify these things and we go in depth on them, you kind of do sit there and reflect on them. And so you don't take them at surface level anymore, which is why I think most people should do, or more people should do this type of research. But kind of going back to chivalry, in the European area where chivalry was prominent, I guess you could say, the adopted codes of chivalry came from a lot of places. So there was pre-chivalric codes that were kind of prominent in Europe around early Middle Ages and early High Middle Ages, if that makes sense, around that time, where it was kind of an uncodified but still very omnipresent, I guess, code of conduct or rules for behavior or something like that, which is essentially the precursor for chivalry in Europe. And it was called, I believe it was called habitus, and it had a few points to it as well, kind of like chivalry does. And it was defined by the same guy, Gautier, which was loyalty, forbearance, hardihood, liberality, and the Davidic ethic, which kind of goes into a sort of like benevolence and things like that. So I guess you could say that would be like benevolence, and then honor. And these were precursors to what chivalry became in the time of the Crusades. And the other thing is, though, that it was also developed from a Muslim or Islamic conception that I don't really know the name to. I never found the name to it when researching it. But essentially, there were a lot of old writings from Rome and from the Muslims in Spain, which were taken into European society and kind of adapted and translated to their own culture, kind of the way you would translate a specific element of one thing or another into a certain context. That's what they did with Roman and certain Muslim writings also. And this is where chivalry also got its origins. It was an early Muslim concept also. And let's see, there was one element in specific that I wanted to talk about that I have here in my notes. Let's see. So yeah, there's actually one writing here called The Ring of the Dove, which was an Arabic kind of text. And it really qualified, I guess you could say, it commentated on the concept of love and how affection and things like that are humanity's outlets for things like chivalry and things like that. And so that was one Arabic text that was one example of things that got translated into Europe, namely Spain and France, I believe. But it was things like that, which were kind of perennial in nature, but that originated in the Islamic and Roman worlds, which were adapted also into European codes of chivalry. And then there was one more thing that I have here that talked about chivalry in the sense of initiatic orders. But do you have anything to kind of comment on before I move on there?
No, I just did have, like, on the point previous when we were talking about being necessarily strong in society, there was a quote I remember hearing, I think off 4chan at once, and I guess it's from an anime. Everyone quell your accusations of degeneracy. There isn't any shame in being weak. The shame is staying weak, and that's from a manga series called Black Clover. If anyone's familiar with that.
No, I've never.
Which I think that sums it. Well, that quote just sums it up pretty well.
Yeah, it does. But yeah, so essentially, one thing that characterized European chivalry over other types of chivalry and even earlier codes of ethics and stuff like that was that a lot of knights dedicated their actions to a woman. It wasn't necessarily it wasn't just a warrior ethos. I've heard chivalry be characterized as a warrior ethos, a knightly piety, and courtly manners. And that is all well and true, there are elements that are forgotten, which are inherently kind of masculine in nature, which are reflected by obviously damehood and femininity. But so the one thing is that the knights and European chivalrous actors, I guess you would say, did a lot of times dedicate their actions to a woman. So symbolically speaking, they are transmissing whatever they're doing, whatever action it is that they're taking, onto a feminine type of principle. Whether or not this was an actual woman or a caricature of a woman, or maybe like a saint or something like that, something unreachable, is varies from context to context. But the overarching theme of dedicating your actions to a woman is one that is not very much touched upon when it comes to European chivalry. But I think that it is one which is present within the mind of, I guess it's present within the instinct of men in general, right? Because I'll speak anecdotally here, but essentially, yeah, I think that most people would feel more success or more virtue or more self-actualization when they are more men, I guess you'd say, would feel more self-actualization when they are doing something in the name of a woman or for a woman, or maybe for a family which is provided to him by a woman, so it's the same kind of deal, than he would if he was doing it by himself. Which is kind of why I think you would see a lot of rich single people being very unhappy, while you see a lot of poor family-oriented people being virtuously happy, if that makes sense.
It is the wealth of the spirit, not of the material, that is the more important aspect of things, which even scriptures throughout the Bible say that very explicitly, that the wealth and material you have of this world, or even looking at pseudo religions like Buddhism, the more wealth and material you've gained in this world will reflect in your next life, or back to Christianity will reflect in the kingdom of heaven, and so on and so forth. But being able to separate yourselves from those material means of wealth, or impiety, or things like that, the pleasures of this world, and dedicating yourself to the honor of a woman and the family, and so on and so forth, and these higher ideals that we hold on all across our societies are the things that lead you to a sort of spiritual ascendance. And even if you do live in rough times or under rough circumstances, like in poverty or through war or something like that, those people who've met that sort of transcendence make it through the other side pretty much unharmed, for greater or lesser extent.
Yeah. And so the other thing is that as you dedicate yourself to as you dedicate your actions to a woman, that really does characterize, it shows the link between devotion as a principle, and then between the devotion to God and the devotion to what is good and what is right, and then also the devotion to the woman, or something that would be sacred in that regard. So this is a well-rounded and holistic conception in that regard as well. Let's see. So one of the things actually that inspired chivalry as a mindset and as a lifestyle, I guess you could say, is that in the different religions, you have in Europe you have Christianity, in the Arabic lands you have Islam, and predating that you also have Rome, you have the Norse, you have all of that, right? In each of these religions, especially of civilizations of the Father, you have a spirituality of a certain type. You have a figure of a certain type which you look up after, or which you look up to, or take on after. Like you take certain behaviors after them. And so chivalry, I would say, is the development of these different not caricatures, but different archetypal aspirations that you need to kind of aspire to when you follow a certain path. So obviously, like I said before, you have the myth of Sigurd, and the kind of heroic element that was portrayed in that myth. And then also you have the ideal of being Christ-like in Christianity. And then for Islam, obviously the sole role model is Muhammad. And each of these different lifestyles or codes or whatever you want to call it popped up in its own, kind of like in a vacuum. And wherever a spirituality of a proper type was present, you did see a code of ethics come up that was very similar and very analogous to other codes of ethics which popped up in other locations with that same certain type. But European chivalry in particular is one that is kind of a mashup of all of these different elements. So you have, like I said, you have the Norse, you have the Roman, you have the Christ-like figure, you have the Arabian contributions, which is kind of what I was going to get into here. In because you have the invasion of Spain with the Arabs who went and conquered that location, and they had a lot of literature which talked about behaving a certain way, behaving properly, and behaving very nobly, and things like that, which kind of permeated through that area and gave inspiration to a lot of people in Europe. And so I think that that's interesting to kind of piece together where chivalry came from and why you have all of these elements put together. You have, the number one, you have the devotion to God, and then you have the devotion to good, and you have the devotion to the woman, or the feminine principle. And you also have the one last thing I wanted to touch upon was the one of the Japanese codes, which held in some way a sacred object as the sole object to kind of protect and inspire the warriors as they did go about their activities.
Oh, if we're talking about the Japanese, you gotta let the local weeaboo introduce the Bushido code.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, that's it. Basically, the same thing, but on a different geographic region of the world that came about of its own volition. So there's a pattern here that kind of reemerges throughout all these different traditions and cultures and whatnot, getting back to the Praxis mentality of things that comes down to everything having this interconnected cosmic intelligence guiding it. And Bushido is essentially just like chivalry, where the 8 pillars of Bushido are justice, courage, compassion, respect, integrity, honor, loyalty, and self-control. And especially that last one is very very interesting point to make, but all of them are very necessary aspects on having a well-rounded man and being a well-rounded man, especially if you take up the moniker of samurai, because that's something where, like many people might know, if you dishonor or disobey any of those tenets of that code, the appropriate response is the traditional what is it? Traditional suicide of oh goodness, I can't believe I've forgotten the name already.
The kamikaze?
Seppuku.
Oh no,
Sorry, seppuku. No, kamikaze is a different thing.
Seppuku.
That's like a battle cry. But seppuku is the thing where it's like if you've committed crimes or dishonored yourself so far out of a way, is like being captured by the enemy or dishonoring your lord or something like that, or violating one of these pillars of Bushido. The penalty is killing yourself to restore that honor, because if the concept goes you would rather die than live dishonorably, and many knights in medieval times lived by that same code. They may not have killed themselves, but they would definitely make great lengths to atone for any of that sin that they had committed. And what Vincent was saying there, translating that into it, is very true too. The difference, I think, with the Japanese, though, and other societies around the world is that they have been able to hold on to this masculine and feminine distinction in their societies, though they do have this same identification of a problem of the domesticated man, or the air quote girl boss woman in their society. There's a far more reined in self-control, like what Bushido states, on preserving these aspects of their culture. And in the West, it's a much greater problem, because there's been far more relentless attacks and like blatant displays of subversion and the destruction of these values that have gone on for, I'd say, centuries now. And that's why you can go to a place like Japan and they still revere the samurai and hold up these classical distinctions between man and woman, where in the West we might see that as chauvinistic or whatnot, but it's a far more balanced and holistic lifestyle. Given they have their own unique problems, they're still much better off on social terms than we are, and that's something that I think we need to address in everything we've stated with the ancient myths that we link back to, or the applications of today of these principles of women acting like women and men acting like men, like I stated at the beginning of all this.
Yeah. Correct me if I'm wrong, but the Japanese had a type of ritual where they kind of consecrated their own weapon, right? They consecrated their sword.
Yes, they did. I think most warrior castes of some flavor variety had a sort of tradition like that. I know there was like the first kill of a knight with his sword is like a consecration of that, like slaying some sort of animal is some sort of rite like that. In Japan, it was much the same, and going along the lines of Bushido, you were never meant to draw your sword unless it takes the lifeblood of another person. And the Gurkha of Myanmar, and or maybe not Myanmar, Malaysia, and by proxy Singapore, live by that same credence, or that same code. And they have a special knife that they carry on them because they're like the special ops of Malaysia and Singapore, respectively, that are like these very stoic Buddhist monks that are also very badass warriors, and they've kept this tradition alive for hundreds of years. And this blade that they keep on them, if they unsheath it to like show someone or demonstrate something with it, they cut themselves ritualistically because they dedicate themselves to this code of, if they draw their blade, then they must draw blood too, because there's no other purpose to draw your blade if that happens. And that's kind of that reverence to the ideal that this show of violence or force or whatever in the masculine doesn't come without its consequence. And the same goes for damehood as well, and the preservation of modesty and being a lady in society.
Yeah, that actually kind of it's actually kind of a good segue over to damehood, because you have damehood as a kind of counterpart to chivalry in the dimension of femininity, right? It's a feminine counterpart.
Actually, they're one and the same. And I think their origins both originate with the Templars.
Yeah, they do.
Because being a dame was an actual like consecrated title given to you, like being a lord or being a knight.
Right.
And the women of high status that were able to earn this title, like Olga of Kiev, were such people. And Olga was even, I think, canonized as a saint in the Eastern Orthodox Church, just going to show like how serious people took her and her actions as a genuine lady and a dame, doing the things she did and living by those codes.
Yeah, and you know what? It's very there's still a differentiation between the sexes, even when coming into something such as this. Like, it was not just that women were knighted just like men, but that they had a different kind of different path to go down, even within the same field. You okay?
Yeah.
All right.
Just banged my elbow, that's all.
Oh no. Okay.
Oh.
But yeah.
Yeah, but like you're saying, it's the like the Evolian sense of men have the way of being a warrior or philosopher, and women have the being a wife or a mother type of deal.
Exactly.
To manifest themselves, self-actualize themselves.
And there was something here. So the article I was reading here a little bit further up, it says, some of you with more quote unquote modern views might start arguing that men and women are created equal and deserve equal rights. Bear in mind, I'm not going to raise the question about the legal equality of genders and female rights in this text. This material will introduce you to a more esoteric and in-depth viewpoint of the subject of masculinity and femininity. The reason I read that is because when the topic, or when the discussion surrounds legality and actual political implementation of these two different forces, it kind of gets very muddied, and that's where you get this archetype of woman in the kitchen type of thing, whereas equality in a sense of differentiated value between the two sexes, having there be kind of an equal opportunity, but even in the way in which that opportunity manifests is different. You know what I mean? Like, you wouldn't be a woman to go through the ranks and get knighted the same as a man would. You would be a woman, you would go through the ranks, but you would be given a womanly title. You would still fulfill a feminine role in society. You wouldn't not want to be a mother because you wanted to be a warrior. You wouldn't instinctively cast aside all of your feminine elements to become a man. And I think that's where feminism lost the drive that it had in the beginning, and then also that's where traditionalists kind of lose sight of or I guess pseudo-traditionalists kind of lose sight of where these two lines are kind of blurred, where there's that gray area in between. Because, as much as it has caused a terrible negative effect in gender relations today, feminism did, in its first wave, still attempt to retain the characteristics of femininity, right? At least in the first and second wave. There might have been a push for women to hold positions that men were traditionally attributed with holding, but there wasn't an interchangeability that was being pushed back then as there is now. And I'm not saying that we should go back to any other form of feminism either, but what I'm saying is that you can see that as this develops throughout history, you can see the various elements of what makes these two things unique be increasingly lost. And then obviously the pushback on that was a lot more of a mature frame of mind. The pushback that you would see against first wave feminism was of a more aristocratic and traditional nature than the pushback you see against third wave feminism, being all against political correctness and filled with vulgar insults and all of this stuff, which doesn't really have any substance to it. It's because the knowledge and the principles which held together a traditional society are no longer understood, no longer even known in most regards too. So I think that was kind of a tangent, but I think that that's kind of represented by the damehood status, is that you can see that there was a typical equality in the sense that I think most people would want today, but it wasn't politically implemented. It was just kind of there. And as soon as it did become objectively and explicitly stated and issued out, that's when it became muddied. That's when the water became muddy. That's when a lot of rigid lines were drawn, and there was no room for a gray area there. You get what I'm saying?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So that was kind of a tangent, but I do think that that's one thing about damehood that I think most people don't take into account. And then one last thing. Oh, go ahead.
Oh yeah, I was gonna say, and like knights, there are still people being issued the declarations of damehood, like in the UK, where the Queen kind of consecrates them as dames and knights or dukes and so forth. Even to today, some of the people like that are Barbara Windsor, or it is one woman, Ellen MacArthur, who was consecrated as a dame at 28. So they're usually women that have attributed some sort of great contribution to their country or their community of some sort, and live by the tenets of chivalry code as well. In our society. And obviously there's difference there because the roles of men and women in society are different, us being different and all. Like being subservient to the man and the circumstance, and getting that guiding factor of God through the patriarch in their lives. But that's basically just the same thing that chivalry has, with one or two more steps added. Taking something like meeting your enemy or the infidel and charging them with no mercy for a woman would be like what we've discussed before, and the matriarchal role of people in society, in being the communicators and being the bargainers and being the negotiators of the moral order within a society, whereas the men face the barbarians coming from the outside.
Yeah, so one of the things which you were saying actually reminded me of two differentiating and seemingly contradictory elements of chivalry, which if you look at it in the modern sense, I guess you could say that these are kind of contradictory, but that one of them is thou shalt respect all weaknesses and shalt constitute thyself as the defender of them. Right? That's number one. And then down here it says, thou shalt make war against the infidel. And in a sense, they kind of use it's spun on its head in modernity, especially, where they use the respect weaknesses, which is number 3, to kind of negate number 6, which is the make war against infidel. They make it as kind of it's framed very much so as you can have one or the other, but not both, right? In this sense that if you respect a weakness and you respect the weak and you are the defender of the weak, then you are also the defender of the infidel, right? But these are two qualitatively different subject matters, I guess you could say. Whereas they are essentially, weakness and infidelity are kind of being compiled in modern society as being one in the same, if that makes sense. And when it comes to chivalry, being the protector of the weak does essentially translate into being the defender of the household, right? Being the defender of the defenseless, not being the defender of something which is morally wrong, which would be the infidel, but something which is morally correct, or which has the capability of being morally correct once it develops, like a child, for example. And so yeah, it really is flipped on its head when you have something like, for example, effeminate men, or demasculinized men, emasculated, one of those words. But that is constituted as, or that is considered as a type of good man, if that makes sense. And then also you have the infidelity and all of the perversions of certain types of love, like we talked about earlier, which is also constituted as, or considered a normal happening, if that makes sense. And so these things in reality are not contradictory to each other in the slightest. And I think that that's where most people would consider chivalry as dead today. It's because it's kind of an oxymoron in a sense. And that's kind of like what I've been setting up here, is that chivalry is very much alive in many places, but it is lacking all of these essential elements. And these are two which are probably the biggest contenders, seen as a dichotomy of one or the other. But it really is a matter of one and the other, and in what order. And so, essentially, when I see people say chivalry is dead because of such and such, they're really misinterpreting what chivalry actually is, if that makes sense. So the war against the infidels, for example, could be seen as not respecting all weaknesses, right? And in that case, chivalry is dead because you make war, right? You're not peaceful. And the inverse of that, other people would consider chivalry as dead because all weaknesses are respected, including infidelity. And that's why chivalry is dead, because there is no war against the infidel, so to speak, right? And it's this dichotomy. But that's just one example. There are many, right? You can find the absences of each of these different points in many different areas, but it's this inconsistency which constitutes a extreme divide in I guess the considerations of what chivalry actually is and what it actually means. And that's why I think that a lot of people would say that chivalry is dead today. And then one last thing I guess we can touch upon is that kind of connecting this back to the last episode, there is a thread written by a guy called Pat Stedman, who is by no means any type of esotericist or any type of like spiritual authority, but it's a thread that I found when researching this, which I found a little bit interesting, and it's about love, and it's about how masculine and feminine expressions of love differ from each other. So he says, the feminine loves through acceptance, like a mother to her child, I love you, now rest. And the masculine loves through alignment, like a father to his child, I love you, now stop. And he says that both forces seek out the other to enter into balance. The feminine is death that seeks out life, the masculine is life that seeks out death. A man bursts life into a woman, and a woman nurtures that life. A woman offers death to a man, and a man spends his life pursuing it. Men and women are custodians of each other. A man makes the decision who or what to kill, because it is only a man that can choose death. And a woman makes the decision who or what to birth, because it is only a woman that can choose life. And I kind of think that that's an interesting concept. Obviously, he's speaking in symbols here, but it is kind of interesting when you put the dichotomy that way. But he speaks later on the same dichotomy and the different elements or expressions of love within it. And he says that for the masculine, love is fundamentally about alignment or truth. And for the feminine, it is fundamentally about acceptance or compassion. And I think that's the single differentiating aspect within personhood of masculinity and femininity, is that man is a lot more objective and femininity is a lot more subjective. And when you put it that way in personhood, you can also translate that into reality. And you can see the different elements of how this is constituted with various symbols, and the like Mother Earth being the nature and the natural aspect, Mother Nature even, right? And like the All-Father or the Sky Father being the heavenly figure, the more absolute figure. And the same thing with the same thing with civilizations who call their land the fatherland versus civilizations who call their land the motherland, and the different values which are interpreted within those civilizations. So it is all very connected. But I think this is a good place to kind of wrap it up. So if any of you guys have any closing statements, or else we can just kind of take off from here.
I just say, like most episodes, this will probably be touched back again in the future, or touched on again in the future, and probably with some special guests to round it out.
Yep, definitely.
I just had a quick comment on that comment about the motherland and the fatherland. It's just something that, at least from my understanding, not exactly like anything important. It's just something that I've noticed in some people. Like, say, for example, someone who was born in one country and lives in another, or someone who is a citizen of one country but has ancestry in another. Like, for example, I'm ethnically Spanish, so I have ancestry in Spain, but I live in America. My family's lived in America for generations. And in that scenario, I would say that my fatherland is America, but my motherland is Spain. And that's just an interesting way that I've seen the terms be interpreted sometimes. I haven't seen it everywhere, but it's just something that I thought was interesting.
Yeah, you know what's funny is that does, like, you're directed by America, right? Your entire personhood is created by the context of living in America, right? But you are generated by Spain. You know what I mean? That, like, where you are from,
pretty much,
is Spain.
So it does have relation to what we were talking about. That's just really interesting.
Yeah,
that people think about it that way, because I think about it that way.
Yeah, that's really cool.
Yeah, that is quite interesting with that last statement and how it kind of ties back to what you're saying. But with that being said, I hope everyone enjoyed listening into today's podcast. Make sure you check out our links in the description down below, where you can find some of our socials. Also, if you're interested in joining our community on Gilded, the link will also be down there in the description down below, or will be there in the description down below. Thank you so much to our founder, Vincent,
No problem.
and our leadership council member, Cody,
As always.
and also, of course, to Goji.
Had fun this time.
This is Myloria, and we hope to see you back here next time at the Praxis Table Talks.